The greatest miracles never announce themselves. They simply knock on an ordinary door when the world least expects them. Ethan Brooks had stopped expecting life to surprise him years ago. At 39 years old, the white American single father believed that peace was built one ordinary day at a time. Every sunrise found him opening the small repair garage beside his modest farmhouse in rural Montana. Every evening ended with helping his 8-year-old daughter Lily finish homework at the kitchen table, and every quiet night reminded him that although life had not been easy since losing his wife, it had still been filled with blessings worth protecting. He never measured success by bank accounts or expensive possessions. Success meant keeping honest promises, serving neighbors with integrity, and making certain Lily always felt safe beneath the roof they called home. Late one October evening, dark storm clouds swallowed the last traces of daylight long before sunset. Fierce wind swept across the valley, bending tall pine trees while heavy rain pounded the gravel driveway leading toward the farmhouse. The old porch light flickered against the storm, casting a warm circle of light through the darkness as thunder rolled across the distant mountains. Ethan had just finished cleaning the dinner dishes while Lily read quietly upstairs when 3 gentle knocks echoed against the front door. The sound was almost hesitant, as though the person outside expected silence instead of kindness. Ethan walked calmly across the wooden floor, unlocked the weathered door, and pulled it open. Cold rain rushed inside with the sharp scent of wet earth and pine. Standing beneath the porch light was a woman in her mid-30s wearing a soaked beige wool coat, her long blonde hair clinging to her shoulders as water dripped onto the old wooden porch. Her elegant face showed exhaustion more than fear, and her striking blue eyes carried the quiet sadness of someone who had spent too many years carrying burdens alone. A small leather travel bag rested beside her feet, the only possession she seemed to have. She looked at Ethan with quiet humility before speaking in a gentle voice. "I am sorry to disturb you. My car broke down several miles away, and I was hoping I could stay somewhere warm until morning." Before Ethan could answer, distant headlights slowly appeared beyond the curtain of rain. 3 black sport utility vehicles stopped along the gravel road several hundred feet from the farmhouse. Their engines remained running, but nobody stepped outside. The vehicles simply waited in the darkness, creating a silent tension that seemed strangely out of place in the peaceful Montana valley. The woman glanced briefly toward the lights before lowering her eyes again, as though she hoped the storm itself might hide her for a little longer. Ethan noticed everything. He noticed the expensive quality of her coat, despite the mud along its hem. He noticed the polished leather bag that had clearly traveled far. He noticed the quiet fear she worked so hard to conceal behind polite words. Yet he asked none of the questions many people would have asked. Years of raising Lily had taught him that every stranger carried a story, and the kindest thing a person could sometimes offer was patience instead of curiosity. Without another word, Ethan reached for the blue knitted blanket hanging beside the doorway, wrapped it gently around the woman's shoulders, and stepped aside with a reassuring smile. "Nobody should spend a Montana night out in this weather," he said softly. "Come inside before you catch cold." For a brief moment, the woman simply looked at him, almost unable to believe that compassion could be offered so freely by someone who knew absolutely nothing about her. Then she whispered, "Thank you," and crossed the threshold into the warm farmhouse. Ethan quietly closed the door behind her as rain continued falling outside, while the black vehicles remained motionless beyond the darkness. Neither of them realized that one simple act of kindness had just opened a door between 2 completely different worlds, and that before the leaves finished falling from the Montana trees, both of their lives would be changed forever. Morning arrived with the gentle scent of fresh coffee drifting through the farmhouse and pale golden sunlight stretching across the kitchen floor. The storm had disappeared as though it had never existed, leaving behind clear blue skies, sparkling pine trees, and tiny drops of rain resting on every blade of grass surrounding the property. Claire Hayes slowly opened her eyes, almost forgetting where she was. For the first time in many months, she had slept through an entire night without waking to ringing telephones urgent meetings, or endless decisions waiting outside her bedroom door. She sat quietly for a moment, wrapped in the same blue knitted blanket Ethan had placed around her shoulders the evening before, listening to something she had not realized she had missed for years. Silence. Not the lonely silence of an empty luxury apartment high above a crowded city, but the comforting silence of a home that breathed with warmth and ordinary life. Downstairs, she heard gentle laughter followed by the sound of plates being placed on a wooden table. When Claire entered the kitchen, Ethan was flipping pancakes while Lily carefully arranged fresh strawberries beside scrambled eggs and homemade biscuits. The little girl smiled brightly the moment she saw Claire. "Good morning. Dad says everyone eats breakfast together here." Claire returned the smile, surprised by how naturally those simple words touched her heart. Ethan poured a cup of fresh coffee and placed it beside an empty chair without asking questions or expecting explanations. "You are welcome to stay until your car situation is sorted out," he said calmly. "There is no rush." Claire quietly thanked him before taking her seat. The breakfast was simple, yet every bite carried a warmth that expensive restaurants had never been able to offer. Lily talked happily about school, her favorite books, and the stray cat that occasionally wandered near the garage looking for breakfast. Ethan listened with genuine attention, smiling more with his eyes than with words. Claire found herself watching the father and daughter with quiet admiration. There was no luxury surrounding them, yet everything about the room felt remarkably rich. After breakfast, Ethan headed toward the repair garage, and Claire offered to help clean the dishes. Lily grinned. "Dad always says people are guests only until they start helping." Claire laughed softly, perhaps for the first time in weeks. Outside, the crisp Montana air carried the smell of pine and motor oil as Ethan opened the large garage doors. Local customers soon arrived with pickup trucks, family sedans, and aging farm equipment needing repairs. Ethan greeted every customer by name, never rushing anyone, never treating a small repair as less important than a large one. Claire quietly observed from the corner of the workshop, fascinated by the trust people placed in him. Some customers thanked him for fixing vehicles long after business hours. Others brought homemade pies or fresh vegetables instead of expensive gifts. Respect had become the currency Ethan valued most. During a quiet moment, Claire noticed invoices scattered across the workbench, handwritten appointment notes pinned beside old calendars, and shelves that could be organized more efficiently. Years of leading one of the largest companies in America instinctively awakened inside her, but she remained careful not to interfere. Instead, she simply asked, "Would you mind if I helped organize a few things while I am here?" Ethan looked up from the engine he was repairing and smiled with the same calm kindness he had shown since opening his front door. "Around here," he replied, "everyone who wants to help is already family." Claire lowered her eyes for a brief moment, deeply moved by words she had never expected to hear from a man who still knew nothing about who she truly was, while far beyond the peaceful valley. The search for the missing billionaire chief executive continued, without anyone imagining she had already found exactly what she had been looking for. Some people spend a lifetime searching for success, only to discover that peace cannot be purchased. Claire began to understand that lesson on her third morning in Montana. The familiar rhythm of the farmhouse had quietly become part of her own routine. She woke before sunrise, folded the blue knitted blanket with care, brewed fresh coffee before Ethan entered the kitchen, and smiled as Lily hurried downstairs wearing a backpack almost as large as herself. Breakfast conversations were never about stock prices, quarterly reports, or impossible deadlines. They were about spelling tests, changing weather, and whether the old apple tree behind the garage might finally produce enough fruit for homemade pie. Claire found herself laughing more often than she had in years, and every smile felt surprisingly genuine. After Lily climbed aboard the small yellow school bus, Ethan unlocked the repair garage, as he always did. Morning sunlight poured through the wide doors, illuminating rows of neatly repaired engines, weathered toolboxes, and shelves that had gradually become crowded through years of honest work. Customers arrived steadily, each greeted with the same quiet respect regardless of the age of their vehicle or the size of the repair bill. Claire watched Ethan patiently explain every repair in simple language, refusing to recommend unnecessary work even when doing so might have earned him more money. Trust, she realized, had become the true foundation of his business. During a slower hour, she quietly began organizing stacks of handwritten invoices by date, placing customer records into labeled folders, and arranging frequently used forms where they could be reached more easily. She never announced what she was doing. She simply noticed small problems and gently solved them. Ethan glanced over while wiping grease from his hands and smiled. "You have a gift for bringing order to things," he said warmly. Claire answered with a modest smile. "I've spent a long time around paperwork." Ethan accepted the explanation without another question. That simple trust touched her more deeply than curiosity ever could. As the days passed, Claire continued making small improvements. She created a cleaner appointment schedule using a simple wall calendar, grouped replacement parts by category, and suggested moving commonly used tools closer to the repair bays to reduce unnecessary walking. None of the changes were expensive, yet everything seemed to flow more smoothly. Customers noticed shorter waiting times and complimented Ethan on how organized the shop had become. He always gave Claire the credit, but she simply shrugged and returned to work. "Small changes can make ordinary days easier," she said softly. Ethan nodded. "That sounds like wisdom instead of business." Claire lowered her eyes, knowing how many corporate executives would have filled an entire conference room discussing improvements that had taken only a few minutes of thoughtful observation. That afternoon, an elderly rancher arrived with an aging pickup truck that had served his family for decades. After inspecting the engine, Ethan quietly explained that the repair would cost much less than the man feared, because only one inexpensive part needed replacing. The rancher looked relieved and thanked him repeatedly. Claire watched the exchange with growing admiration. In the world she came from, people often celebrated finding ways to increase profits. Here, Ethan celebrated finding ways to ease someone else's burden. As evening settled across the Montana Valley, golden sunlight stretched through the garage before fading behind distant mountains. Claire stood outside beside Ethan, holding 2 steaming mugs of tea while the scent of pine drifted gently through the cool air. Neither of them spoke for several moments. Finally, Claire whispered, almost to herself, "I forgot what it feels like to be somewhere that asks nothing from me." Ethan looked toward the quiet horizon before answering with calm certainty. Sometimes people do not need another place to work harder. Sometimes they only need a place where they are allowed to breathe. Claire held the warm mug a little tighter, silently wondering how a man who had never stepped inside a corporate boardroom understood the human heart better than almost everyone she had ever met. While hundreds of miles away, countless people continued searching for the missing chief executive without realizing she had finally found something far more valuable than being found. The truth has a quiet way of finding people, even when nobody is looking for it. Nearly a week had passed since Claire first stepped through Ethan's front door, and life at the farmhouse had settled into a peaceful rhythm that felt strangely timeless. Each morning began with coffee, breakfast, and Lily hurrying toward the waiting school bus while Ethan opened the garage for another honest day of work. Claire continued helping wherever she could, never acting like someone giving instructions, but like someone grateful simply to contribute. Customers appreciated the cleaner work area, the organized appointment schedule, and the smoother flow of each repair without realizing that the woman quietly sorting paperwork in the corner had once managed thousands of employees across the country. Ethan noticed the improvements as well, but he never treated Claire differently because of her abilities. In his eyes, kindness mattered far more than credentials. One crisp afternoon, while waiting for a replacement part to arrive, Ethan walked into the farmhouse kitchen and found Lily reading a local newspaper that had been left on the porch. The little girl looked up with innocent curiosity. "Dad, this lady looks a little like Miss Claire." Ethan accepted the newspaper and glanced to the front page. A large photograph showed a blonde businesswoman standing before a room filled with reporters beneath the headline announcing that a nationally recognized technology company was still searching for its missing chief executive officer after several days without public contact. Ethan looked from a newspaper toward the living room where Claire was quietly watering a small plant near the window. The resemblance was unmistakable, yet he folded the newspaper without another word and placed it beside the coffee maker. He had learned long ago that trust sometimes meant waiting until another person was ready to speak. Claire noticed the newspaper later that afternoon. Her eyes rested briefly on the headline before she slowly folded it and placed it back exactly where she had found it. She did not deny anything. She did not explain anything. She simply stood silently by the kitchen window watching autumn leaves drift across the yard. Ethan approached with 2 warm mugs of tea and handed one to her without mentioning the article. "Beautiful evening," he said softly. Claire accepted the mug, her hands trembling almost too slightly to notice. "Yes," she whispered. "It is peaceful here." That single sentence carried more emotion than an entire conversation. As the sun began to sink behind the mountains, the distant sound of engines echoed through the valley. Ethan looked toward the gravel road, where 3 familiar black sport utility vehicles slowly approached before stopping near the entrance to the property. This time the engines turned off. Several men and women wearing tailored business suits stepped out, their expressions filled not with anger, but with visible relief. They paused respectfully outside the garage, as though uncertain whether they were interrupting something important. Claire quietly closed her eyes for one brief moment. The peaceful refuge she had discovered was finally catching up with the world she had left behind. Ethan wiped his hands on a clean shop towel and calmly walked toward the visitors without hesitation or suspicion. Before anyone could speak, one distinguished gray-haired executive looked past Ethan, saw Claire standing in the open garage doorway, and his eyes immediately filled with emotion. "Chief Executive Officer Hayes," he said with unmistakable respect, "we have been searching everywhere for you." The entire valley seemed to fall silent. Claire slowly stepped forward into the fading golden light, while every executive around her straightened their posture with quiet admiration. Ethan looked from Claire to the visitors, finally understanding the extraordinary truth that had remained hidden inside the ordinary woman who had shared breakfast at his table, folded laundry beside Lily, and organized his little garage with nothing more than gentle humility. Yet the only expression on his face was the same calm kindness he had shown on the stormy night when she first knocked on his door. Respect is revealed not by how people treat power, but by how they treat someone before they know power exists. The executive stood silently near the entrance of the garage, their polished shoes now dusted with fine Montana gravel that no expensive office building had ever placed beneath their feet. Every one of them looked toward Claire with visible relief, but none dared interrupt the quiet moment unfolding before them. Claire slowly walked forward, her eyes filled with gratitude rather than authority. For the first time in many years, she did not feel like the leader of a billion-dollar company. She simply felt like the woman who had been welcomed into a stranger's home without a single question. The gray-haired executive stepped closer and spoke carefully. "Miss Hayes, the board has been deeply concerned. Thousands of employees have been waiting for your return. We have postponed major decisions because nobody wanted to move forward without you." Claire listened quietly before turning toward Ethan. He stood beside the open garage door with the same relaxed posture he carried every ordinary afternoon, a clean shop towel resting over one shoulder after another day of honest work. His expression had not changed. There was no shock, no excitement, no attempt to impress anyone standing before him. He simply smiled gently and asked the same question he might have asked any customer who had stopped by after a long drive. "Have all of you had lunch yet?" The executives exchanged surprised glances, almost uncertain they had heard correctly. One younger vice president gave a small, nervous laugh before realizing Ethan was completely sincere. Claire lowered her head for a brief moment as emotion filled her eyes. Throughout countless board meetings, she had listened to presentations worth billions of dollars. Yet no question had ever touched her heart as deeply as those 6 simple words. Ethan looked toward the farmhouse. Lily and I made chicken pot pie this morning. There's plenty if everyone is hungry. The invitation carried no ceremony, no expectation, only genuine hospitality. Within minutes, the executives found themselves sitting around the same wooden kitchen table where Claire had shared breakfast every morning during the past week. Fine tailored business suits surrounded homemade food served on simple ceramic plates. Fresh biscuits, warm vegetables, and apple pie replaced luxury catering and formal dining rooms. Conversation gradually shifted away from financial reports and toward ordinary life. One executive admitted he had not eaten a home-cooked meal in months because of constant travel. Another smiled while listening to Lily proudly explain how she helped feed the chickens every weekend. Claire quietly watched the scene unfold, realizing that the people surrounding the table seemed lighter than they had looked inside any corporate meeting. After lunch, the executives respectfully waited outside, while Claire walked with Ethan toward the porch. Autumn leaves drifted gently across the yard, and the blue knitted blanket remained folded neatly over the wooden porch swing. Claire looked at the peaceful valley stretching beyond the fields before speaking. "I came here because I forgot who I was beneath my job title," she said softly. "You gave me something nobody else knew I needed." Ethan rested his hands in his jacket pockets and looked toward the mountains glowing beneath the afternoon sun. "You already carried everything good inside you," he replied calmly. "Sometimes life simply brings people to the place where they can finally hear their own heart again." Claire smiled through grateful tears, knowing those words would remain with her long after she returned to Chicago. When the black sport utility vehicles finally prepared to leave, she paused before stepping inside. Looking back at Ethan, Lily, the little farmhouse, and the modest repair garage, she understood that she was not leaving behind the most important chapter of her life. She was carrying it home, determined that the quiet dignity she had discovered in a small Montana valley would become the foundation for every decision she would make from that day forward. The smallest acts of kindness often travel farther than the grandest displays of power. Several months passed after Claire returned to Chicago, yet not a single morning began without her remembering the quiet Montana farmhouse, the smell of fresh coffee, the sound of Lily laughing before school, and the simple repair garage where honesty mattered more than titles. The blue knitted blanket remained folded across the back of the sofa in her private office, never because she needed warmth, but because it reminded her of the place where she had rediscovered herself. Employees who had worked beside Claire for years gradually noticed a remarkable change. Meetings became shorter and more thoughtful. Every proposal now began with one simple question: how will this improve the lives of ordinary people? Profit remained important, but purpose now stood beside it. Executives who once measured success only through financial reports were encouraged to visit local communities, speak with family business owners, and understand the people whose lives were affected by every decision made inside the company. Claire also introduced a nationwide initiative designed to provide technology, training, and practical support to independent repair shops, family farms, neighborhood stores, and other small businesses that form the heart of countless American towns. During the first leadership meeting announcing the program, she shared no stories about billion-dollar strategies. Instead, she spoke about dignity, trust, and the extraordinary value of people who quietly served others without seeking recognition. Across the country, the program quickly gained respect because it treated small business owners as partners rather than statistics. Meanwhile, life in Montana continued much as it always had. Ethan still unlocked the garage before sunrise each morning. Lily still hurried to school with cheerful excitement, and neighbors still stopped by simply to share coffee or conversation before having their vehicles repaired. Ethan had never expected anything in return for helping Claire, and he certainly never imagined his quiet example had reached corporate boardrooms hundreds of miles away. One bright spring afternoon, a familiar black sport utility vehicle slowly entered the gravel driveway, but this time it arrived alone. Claire stepped out wearing comfortable casual clothes instead of formal business attire, carrying the carefully folded blue knitted blanket in her hands. Lily ran across the yard with joyful excitement, wrapping Claire in a warm hug before she could even reach the porch. Ethan smiled from the garage doorway, exactly as he had on the first evening they met. Claire walked toward him and gently placed the blanket into his hands. "I borrowed this much longer than I intended," she said with a grateful smile. Ethan quietly unfolded it before placing it across the old porch swing once again. "Some things are meant to find their way home," he replied. As the three of them sat together watching the golden sunset settle over the Montana hills, there were no cameras, no reporters, and no formal announcements. The world still recognized Claire as one of the most successful chief executive officers in America, while Ethan remained the owner of a modest repair garage in a peaceful valley. Yet neither title mattered in that quiet moment. What remained was something far greater than wealth or reputation. A father who never stopped choosing kindness. A woman who learned that true leadership begins with humility. A little girl whose simple faith reminded two adults that home is not defined by walls or status, but by the people who welcome one another without conditions. As evening light slowly faded across the porch, the valley became wonderfully still once again, and in that peaceful silence they all understood the same enduring truth. The greatest success in life is not finding a place where the world admires you. It is finding a place where your heart is finally at peace. Quiet examples have a way of changing lives long after the people who set them never realize what they have done. Spring slowly turned into summer across the Montana Valley, and the little repair garage continued serving neighbors with the same honesty that had earned Ethan Brooks their trust for so many years. Every morning began before sunrise with fresh coffee, the sound of birds settling in the pine trees, and Lily waving goodbye as the familiar yellow school bus disappeared down the country road. Nothing about Ethan's daily routine had become more glamorous after meeting Claire. He still repaired worn pickup trucks, changed engine oil, replaced aging brakes, and patiently explained every repair to customers as though they were lifelong friends instead of business transactions. Yet hundreds of miles away, the quiet lessons he had unknowingly shared continued spreading farther than either of them could have imagined. Claire's nationwide small business initiative expanded into dozens of states, helping family-owned garages, neighborhood hardware stores, local farms, independent diners, and countless other community businesses modernize without losing the personal values that made them special. Instead of measuring success only through quarterly earnings, the company now celebrated stories of trust, compassion, and service. Employees were encouraged to spend time listening before offering solutions, and many returned describing experiences that reminded them why they had chosen their careers in the first place. One warm June afternoon, a neatly addressed envelope arrived in Ethan's mailbox bearing the company logo Claire had never once mentioned during her stay in Montana. Ethan opened it at the kitchen table while Lily finished coloring a picture beside him. Inside was a handwritten letter from Claire rather than a formal corporate document. She thanked Ethan once again for welcoming a stranger without asking for anything in return. She explained that the values shaping the company's new direction had not come from expensive consultants or complicated strategies. They had come from watching one father quietly serve his family and community with unwavering dignity. Enclosed with the letter was an invitation asking Ethan to join a newly formed community advisory council composed of ordinary small business owners from across America. The position required only a few meetings each year and one simple responsibility: reminding successful people never to forget the everyday families they existed to serve. Ethan read the letter twice before setting it gently on the table. He smiled with quiet gratitude, but also with uncertainty. "I fix engines," he said softly. "I'm not sure I belong advising large companies." Lily looked up from her drawing and tilted her head thoughtfully. "Maybe they do not need someone who knows everything," she said. "Maybe they need someone who remembers what really matters." Ethan looked at his daughter for a long moment before laughing gently. "You sound much wiser than 8 years old." Lily smiled proudly. "Miss Claire says good ideas can come from small places." Those simple words settled peacefully inside Ethan's heart. A week later, he accepted the invitation, not because he wanted recognition, but because he believed that if sharing ordinary experiences could help another family somewhere in America, then it was worth the effort. When he attended the first advisory meeting in Chicago, executives greeted him with genuine respect rather than ceremony. Claire welcomed him not as a famous guest, but as an old friend whose quiet example had become the foundation of something much larger than either of them had expected. Sitting around that conference table, Ethan realized the distance between a modest Montana garage and a corporate headquarters was not measured in miles after all. It was measured only by whether people chose to lead with pride or with humility. And thanks to one unexpected knock on a rainy autumn night, both worlds had finally learned to speak the same language of kindness. The strongest friendships are often built without promises because they are strengthened by countless ordinary moments of trust. By early autumn, Ethan had grown comfortable traveling to Chicago a few times each year for the Community Advisory Council, yet every visit reminded him how eager he was to return home to Montana. The towering glass buildings, busy streets, and endless schedules impressed him, but they never changed the values he carried inside. Claire always made certain the meetings remained practical rather than ceremonial. Instead of beginning with financial charts, she invited local business owners to describe the real challenges facing their communities. Ethan spoke honestly about rising repair costs, young families trying to balance work and home, and the importance of treating every customer with fairness, even when nobody was watching. The executives listened carefully because they had learned that wisdom did not always arrive wearing an expensive suit. Between meetings, Claire often found herself smiling at the quiet confidence Ethan carried wherever he went. He never tried to influence people through status. He simply shared his experiences, and somehow every room became calmer after he spoke. When the final meeting of the season ended, Claire surprised everyone by announcing that the next advisory gathering would not be held in Chicago. It would take place in Montana. Several weeks later, a small group of executives arrived at Ethan's repair garage, not for a publicity event, but to spend time understanding the community that had inspired so much change. They worked alongside local volunteers repainting a youth recreation center, visited family-owned businesses, and shared lunch with ranchers, teachers, mechanics, and neighbors who had never expected to meet corporate leaders. Claire wore comfortable jeans and a simple sweater instead of business attire, blending naturally into the small town that had quietly become part of her heart. Lily happily guided several visitors through the garage, proudly explaining how her father believed every customer deserved honesty before profit. The executive smiled, realizing they had heard those same words many times inside the boardroom. Yet hearing them from an 8-year-old somehow made them even more meaningful. That evening, everyone gathered outside the farmhouse as the sun slowly disappeared behind the mountains. Long wooden tables held homemade casseroles, fresh bread, apple pie, and steaming coffee prepared by neighbors who insisted every guest should feel welcome. Laughter drifted across the fields while children played nearby, and the cool autumn breeze carried the familiar scent of pine through the valley. Claire stood quietly beside Ethan on the porch, looking across the peaceful landscape that had changed the direction of her life. "I thought I came here to escape," she admitted softly. "Now I understand I was actually coming home to the person I was meant to become." Ethan looked toward the old repair garage, glowing beneath warm porch lights, before answering with his familiar calm smile. "Sometimes the road that changes our lives is the one we never planned to travel." Claire nodded gently, knowing every word was true. As the evening grew quieter, she realized that the greatest achievement of the past year had never appeared in a business report or a newspaper headline. It lived inside the trust shared between ordinary people who chose kindness before judgment, humility before pride, and service before recognition. In that peaceful Montana valley, surrounded by friends instead of strangers, Claire understood that success had finally found its true home, and Ethan quietly realized that opening his front door on one rainy night had created a future neither of them could ever have imagined, yet one they would both continue protecting with gratitude dignity and unwavering respect. The quietest victories are often the ones that leave the deepest echoes in the human heart. 1 year passed, and the seasons carried the little Montana valley through snow, spring blossoms, warm summer evenings, and another brilliant autumn. Ethan Brooks continued unlocking the repair garage before sunrise, just as he always had, greeting every customer with the same patient smile that had never depended on recognition or success. Lily had grown taller, her curiosity even brighter, and she still believed that every visitor deserved to be welcomed like a neighbor. Claire continued leading her company with renewed purpose. Yet no matter how full her calendar became, she never allowed another season to pass without returning to the farmhouse that had quietly changed the course of her life. On a crisp October afternoon, the entire community gathered for the annual Harvest Festival held beside the town square. Local families displayed homemade pies, fresh vegetables, handcrafted quilts, and classic pickup trucks polished with obvious pride. Children laughed while musicians played familiar country songs beneath colorful autumn trees. There were no grand stages reserved for important people, because in this small town, everyone shared the same ground. Claire arrived without ceremony, wearing comfortable boots, blue jeans, and a simple sweater that made her almost indistinguishable from everyone else. Many neighbors recognized her, but they greeted her not as a famous chief executive officer. They greeted her as Claire, the woman who had once helped organize the garage and washed breakfast dishes without ever mentioning who she was. That simple acceptance remained one of the greatest gifts she had ever received. Later that afternoon, Ethan parked an old pickup truck outside the garage after finishing one final repair before joining the celebration. As he walked toward the festival with Lily beside him, several families stopped to thank him for helping them throughout the year. Ethan accepted every kind word with quiet humility before changing the subject to ask about their children, their farms, or their health. Claire watched from across the square and smiled, realizing that true respect could never be demanded. It could only be earned through years of consistent kindness. As evening settled over the valley, neighbors gathered on the farmhouse porch one final time before heading home. The familiar blue knitted blanket rested across the old porch swing, exactly where Ethan had placed it months earlier. Claire sat beside Ethan while Lily leaned comfortably against them, watching the golden sunset spread across distant mountains and fields that glowed beneath the fading light. Nobody felt the need to fill the peaceful silence with unnecessary words. The wind gently carried the scent of pine through the valley, while porch lights slowly illuminated one home after another. Finally, Lily looked toward the horizon and smiled. "Do you remember the storm when Miss Claire first came here?" Ethan nodded gently. Claire laughed softly before answering. "I remember believing I'd lost my way." Lily squeezed both of their hands. "Maybe you had to get lost so you could find the right family." Neither adult spoke immediately because the little girl had quietly expressed a truth neither of them had ever fully found the words to describe. Ethan looked toward the repair garage that had provided a simple living, then toward Claire, whose life had been transformed not by wealth, but by grace freely given, and finally toward Lily, whose innocent wisdom had become the heart of their shared journey. The sun disappeared beyond the mountains, leaving behind a sky filled with gentle shades of gold and deep blue. In that peaceful silence, they all understood that the greatest legacy a person can leave is not measured by titles, fortune, or applause. It is measured by every open door, every compassionate choice, every second chance, and every quiet act of dignity that continues changing lives long after the moment itself has passed.